Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait 30 seconds and then we'll get the webinar underway. Okay, I think we can start now. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Goodbye Coal, Hello Clean, Asia's Energy Transition, organized by the Global Wind Energy Council and EMBER as an official side event of the UNFCCC Asia Pacific Climate Week 2021. Global Wind Energy Council, or GWEC, is a nonprofit international trade association representing wind power in emerging markets worldwide, while EMBER is an independent climate and energy think tank focused on the global electricity transition. My name is Joyce Lee. I'm head of policy and projects at GWEC, and I have the privilege of being your host for today's webinar. Just before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping rules. So throughout the webinar, you can submit your questions for our panelists using the Q&A function on the Zoom toolbar, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And we will be picking up those questions during the panel discussion, which should last about 40 minutes during this webinar. We note that this webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out a link to the recording and the presentation used today about 24 hours after the webinar concludes. If you're having technical issues at any point, you can send us a message in the chat function, and it bears repeating that we wish to be as discussive as possible during this webinar, so please do make use of the Q&A function to send in not just your questions, but also your comments and thoughts as we go on. With that being said, let's kick off. Ahead of COP26, the global wind energy industry has come together to form the Global Wind 26 to highlight wind's role in the global energy transition and to press policymakers to raise their ambitions and to roll up their sleeves to unlock renewables growth. The landmark reports from the International Energy Agency and the International Renewable Energy Agency show historic alignment in front of us. A rapid phase out of fossil fuels like coal-fired generation will be a clear prerequisite for the world to achieve a 1.5-degree pathway, let alone to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And this phase out must happen concurrent to a rapid acceleration of wind and renewable energy deployment, particularly in Asia, where it doesn't bear emphasizing that is the fastest growing economic region in the world and is also on track to exceed 50% of global GDP by 2040. Much of this growth is going to come from China, India, Japan, and South Korea, as well as key Southeast Asian economies, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, making it crucial to explore how these Asian countries can seize the opportunities of a coal-to-clean transformation. So to help us understand this landscape and what both state and non-state actors can do, we have a truly fantastic panel today, which includes Dave Jones, Global Program Lead at EMBER, Cameron Smith, Managing Director of Offshore and Southeast Asia at Mainstream Renewable Power, Amar Variawa, Director of Public Affairs of India and Southeast Asia at Vestas, and last but not least,
for some slides. So it's so good to be talking here about the coal to clean transition. I was quite surprised it was the only presentation during Asia Climate Week that mentions coal in the title. So very exciting for me on that. Joyce, can you unshare your screen so I can then share? Thank you very much. Cool. Okay, so what I want to do is start off by talking a little bit about the coal to clean transition at the moment globally. Where are we? A little bit about where we need to be, and for that unpacking a little bit about the IEA scenario that's been published, and then a little bit about that gap in between. So where are we on target for? What do we need to do to get onto that pathway for 1.5 degrees from where we are today? So already the world's doing a pretty good job stepping up on wind and solar generations. So this is the share of wind and solar in different countries across the G20. And you can see across the world, we're getting almost 1/10 of our electricity from just wind and solar last year. And that's double what it was just 5 years ago in 2015. Europe's leading the way with that, with double that, with almost 1/5 of its electricity from wind and solar. But some key Asian countries in there are up and around that world average of 1/10. So you've got China there, you've got India, you've got Japan in the mix. You've got South Korea kind of starting that journey on wind and solar now. And then you've got Indonesia, which has kind of got some plans for that, but is kind of still a little bit on the starting blocks for wind and solar. When wind and solar is being built out, it's really cool, and it's increasing the share of the electricity mix, but also electricity demand is growing as well. So this is the change in electricity generation across the world, and you can see just right at the top for China, you can see that wind and solar is making a big difference. They're building an awful lot of it. It's not meeting all of the electricity demand growth, so you're also having to step up on coal generation there. The same is true of India. A great step up in wind and solar, but still not meeting all of electricity demand, and certainly across the Asia Pacific, that's the state of affairs in so many countries at the moment. Very high electricity demand growth, wind and solar meeting some of that, but not all of that. And what that means is that share of the coal generation is going up. So we started the decade. This is global coal generation. We started this century with a third of the global coal generation in Asia Pacific, and 2 decades later, in 2020, you can see that 77% of the world's coal generation is now in Asia Pacific. In total, coal generation is about 30% of all the world's CO2 emissions last year. So just from coal power in Asia Pacific, that's about almost a quarter of humanity's CO2 emissions from last year. So that's the kind of where we are today. Where do we need to be? Well, we're looking for pathways, and the IEA came along with their great pathway for net zero. And I want to explain why that was so important. There was an awful lot of expectations that was placed on that pathway. Was it 1.5 degrees aligned? Yes, it was. Is it a reasonable pathway? Well, we think so. They say it's a pathway to 1.5 degrees. It won't be the pathway. It also has a low reliance on BECCS, direct air capture, and other kind of unicorn technologies. So it was quite realistic in terms of the ambition that was required today. Is their pathway achievable? Mostly so. They've got a series of milestones. This isn't just a black box. This is an actual thought out plan. It's not a model. It is more of a pathway. Is it desirable? This is really cool for the IEA and a big change for the IEA. They did the SDS scenario before that you may have followed. They always kind of portrayed as, oh, do we have to do that? But with the net zero report, they've really tell a real positive people-led story about how that's going to boost jobs and boost the economy coming out of this. And that's really what leaders need to hear. They need to hear about why, like, what are the pluses about going to 1.5 degrees. Does it signal the end of fossil fuels? Yes, it does. It says that no new fossil fuel investment is needed, which is a huge statement for the IEA to make. Is it central in their works? Seemingly, yes. And it was really nice seeing, I don't know if you saw the gas report earlier this week, they actually headlined with a piece of the headline that that gas use is growing and is threatening the 1.5 degrees because of that increase in fossil gas use that they're seeing on the ground. And will it stimulate governments into immediate action? Because this modelling is involved in the COP process, so many governments are aware of it. It's really getting people talking, and that's another reason why I wanted to mention it here. And I also want to kind of make an ask, which is you read it yourself, you forward on the summary to policymakers, to other people, to people that you're working with, so others can also talk about it and share it as well. And as part of it, it's not, like I say, it's not just a black box. They come out with these milestones, they make it real. That you can try and work out what it means for your own organization. I had that tweet there. I wanted a framed picture to hang on my wall, so I printed one off myself, and my colleague went a step further and got it translated into Mandarin to stick on the front page of a China daily, which was quite exciting. So the IEA are quite clear that the key for 1.5 degrees in their modelling is a 2020s coal to clean power transition. And you can see that chart on the left-hand side, the CO2 emissions by sector. Power turns from the biggest CO2 emitting sector in 2020 to the only clean sector by 2040. And the IEA didn't have this chart, so we had to make it, but we did a water flow diagram of the emissions cuts that need to happen across this decade. Total CO2 emissions need to fall by 38%. And over half of that fall comes from coal power alone. Much of the rest of that is either from gas and oil power or from indirectly from electrification in other sectors. So the electricity industry, and specifically the reduction in coal power, is absolutely critical to 1.5 degrees. And when you unpack the coal, they have this chart here, and the key messaging they pull out on coal is that coal power needs to phase out in OECD by 2030 and globally by 2040. The inefficient coal power needs to phase out globally by 2030. So on this red line on the chart where they've got subcritical coal, inefficient coal power, that needs to close by 2030. And on the right, you can see we've laid out the split of the fleet in different countries based on its technology. And you can see that in China and India and a large part of Asia Pacific, so many of the coal plants are subcritical coal that would need to be phased out this decade. And in total, that fall in coal power that needs to happen this decade is massive. It's a 69% fall. That's even slightly less than what the IPCC say in their modeling for 1.5 degrees. However you cut that modeling, it's always coal power in the 2020s that take that big fall. And the IEA show that coal needs to be replaced, and we'll go through this. And it's not just coal that needs to be replaced; it's also gas that needs to be replaced. So to get to 1.5 degrees, because that carbon budget is so limited, it's not just about phasing out coal generation; it's also about phasing out gas and getting to 100% clean electricity globally by 2040. And that's going to be a huge aim for the politicians to go for. And like, what clean investment do you need to go with that? Well, according to the IEA, 3/4 of that new generation is from wind and solar alone. So you can argue about all the other generation that you'll hear everyone talking about. IEA did a report on hydro this week. Everyone loves talking about nuclear or bioenergy or CCS or hydrogen, but ultimately they're only 1/4 of that total pie. And a lot of that is to provide the megawatts for the flex around wind and solar rather than the megawatt hours. So it's really that growth in wind and solar that's going to drive that shift from coal and also gas to clean electricity. And that means that for both wind and solar, that's a 4-time step up on 2040 build rates that we've got to see by the end of this decade. The forecast for 2021, 22, they're not great. They're not stepping up in the way that we need them to be stepping up. So much more action needs to go on stepping up the build rates for wind and solar, and that means an awful lot more money. So these numbers are just eye-watering on the amount of investment that's needed. Basically means this decade on renewable electricity alone, $1 trillion per year on average, and that's twice the level of total fossil fuel investment that we saw last decade. So insane amounts of money to be able to make that happen. And that's obviously because the wind and solar investments are upfront investments that's coming into that give very cheap electricity once they're built. So just to take out those milestones from the IEA reports, no new coal mines from 2021. 2030 OECD coal phase out and global inefficient coal power phase out, and enabling that rising up to a terawatt per year build rates of wind and solar. And then these targets around clean power, so for OECD, for the US, for Europe, for Japan, for Korea, 100% clean power by 2035, and then globally by 2040. Some really stretching targets reflecting that the carbon budget we have is very limited. And that ambition really needs to come from the power sector driving that. And if you look at other models, they will tell the same thing. So Joyce mentioned about Irena in this as well. And this is their report out 2 weeks ago on 1.5 degrees pathway. What was their key graphic? Their key graphic was from now until 2030, we need a rapid phase out of coal power expansion and expansion of renewable power. For the United Nations, modeling came out last week on the energy transition to hit the SDG 7. What's their recommendation? Sure enough, a phase out of coal by 2030 in OECD, 2040 globally. So all the pathways kind of pointing towards the same way. And what does that mean on international progress and where we are today? Well, some really interesting pieces came out of the G7 when they met 2 months ago. They came out and they committed to 1.5 degrees, which is a big thing in the first place. And they also have announced 2030 targets that are so big, it's almost meaning a halving of CO2 emissions in G7 countries by 2030. It also means they also said about achieving overwhelmingly decarbonised power system in the 2030s. So now that ball is rolling, not just on coal, but also on gas, on stopping new gas investment now, saying you don't need that gas investment, saying that we have enough clean technology at our fingertips to meet that rising electricity demand and the phase out of coal. And on coal, a lot of action. So recognizing coal is the biggest single emitter, international investments in unabated coal should stop now. There wasn't any kind of big piece with all of that we were hoping for, but behind the scenes there is that real focus on coal, and you can see that in the way that politics is playing out. So specifically for Asia Pacific, Korea is now planning its 2030 pledge, what to bring to the table. What we'd really like to see is a coal phase out date that goes alongside that as well, and it's not clear to what extent Korea will step up on that. For Japan, they've made that 2030 pledge already, but they don't really know how to achieve that, and especially around coal. Like, what does that mean for coal? And that's a process that they're going through at the moment. For India, they made that really lofty target from Modi about 2.5 years ago now, but kind of inertia since, and the wind and solar build rates are, if anything, slowing down, and it kind of needs a bit of a re-injection of life from that side. But some really good news on coal throughout the rest of Southeast Asia, especially around stopping the build out of new coal, and you can see a real political emphasis on that in so many countries now. The big elephant in the room, China, with half the world's coal generation. President Xi at the UN Climate Summit came out and gave this statement around coal, which was very exciting. But according to the own modeling of the Chinese academics, to hit 1.5 degrees, that carbon budget that is aligned with China's 2060 net zero, it basically means a 2/3 reduction in power sector emissions in the 2030s, according to their own, by 2030 in their own modeling. So there's a difference between we're going to kind of phase down or reduce coal generation in 2026 to 2030 5-year plan, so we're really going to collapse coal generation. So it'll be interesting to see how China progresses with that. Also, we've got the G20 coming up. At the moment, they're struggling to commit to 1.5 degrees as a statement, and how do you bring coal into that? And then obviously you've got COP coming up, and the COP president really focusing on consigning coal to history. So coal will be a big feature throughout the rest of this year. And you may have heard of Powering Past Coal Association. It's become a bit of a badge of honor now to say that you're going beyond coal, which is quite exciting. So it was convened by the UK and Canadian governments to not just get national governments, but also subnational governments and companies in there as well to commit to phasing out coal. So really exciting to see how that's going and how many names are on that at the moment. And if your company isn't on here, if your region that you're working in isn't on here, please do try and work to that, because it's a real badge of honor that's giving great international momentum to phase out coal. So just to end on as a key takeaways that I'd love that I wanted to bring across for this is that wind and solar transition has really started already in earnest. It's doubled in 5 years. It's now a tenth of global electricity, but we need to be raising those build rates by 4. We need so much more action, and that's not just on the clean side, but also on the coal side. So how do we get commitments to stop new coal power plants and mines? How do we get commitments to phase out coal power altogether? And ultimately, how do we get commitments to 100% clean power? So this is really looking beyond just a phase out of coal, and also planning for the phase out of gas power as well. And above all, just to highlight what the Irena's IEA and all the other rest of the modeling is showing, which is really the key for 1.5 degrees, is this decade in the 2020s to see that rapid transition from coal to clean in the power sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was an excellent scene-setting presentation, I think, for this discussion today. And I mean, share the feeling of being thrilled to see this consensus emerging across the IPCC, UNFCCC, IEA, and Irena institutions in terms of modeling. But as you've pointed out, it raises a lot of questions about deliverability, feasibility, financing requirements. It's hard to miss those question marks that you've appended to each country's commitment as you were doing the stock take of coal phase out progress. So let's start to unpack some of these issues. We'll invite on stage with us Cameron Smith, Managing Director Offshore and Southeast Asia at Mainstream, Amar Variawa, Director of Public Affairs India and Southeast Asia Vestas, and Benoit Nguyen, Head of Department Renewables Asia Pacific DNV. And I think when we look at the Asia Pacific region, it's much more than just a grouping. Let's start to characterize this group of countries by their power needs, the population size, geographic conditions, the financing environment, all these things that will impact their transition. So let's start to look at that characterization a little bit and discuss how that progress of coal phase out looks like between the advanced economies in the region. So we're talking about Japan, South Korea, Australia, versus the emerging economies in the region, such as India and Southeast Asia, and what the different considerations are when we talk about coal phase out and clean energy ramp up in emerging economies in particular. And I think, Benoit, you're tuning in from Ho Chi Minh City, so it's very appropriate to turn to you first for this question.
Okay, yeah, I think I want to just maybe take a step back and just put renewable energy in the context. The power needs to be consumed on the spot. So it's a pretty big challenge to get a grid operating at 100% renewables. You need a way to balance the variability. So you need to find a way to store this energy. And I think it's where we see like there's a base of generation, be it coal, be it gas, but you will need this kind of base, or you will need a storage solution to be able to ramp up renewables in the grid of the future. So each country has a different potential. I think hydro is a very great way to increase the power of renewables you can get in the grid. But actually, most of the forecasts I've seen, they give a big part to gas to be able to make this transition from the energy system, energy mix we have at the moment, and the energy mix of the future. Now, for the pledge of phasing out coal, I think it's very challenging. So I'm in Vietnam, so I can give you the example of Vietnam is working on the PDP-8 at the moment. It's been delayed, so it hasn't been issued yet, but from the draft we've seen, they're actually reducing a lot their targets in terms of coal generation. So I think in Vietnam, so we've seen an installation of about 16 gigawatts of solar, and at the moment it's about, I guess like 7 gigawatts of wind being constructed. So the government sees a great opportunity to actually not install more coal in their grid, but take the opportunity step forward and install renewable energy first. Now they also face a lot of grid challenges, and so there's a lot of curtailment. And so I think is what all these countries will face as they ramp up renewables significantly. They will need to bring in more gas, I think, in the coming 5 years to be able to balance their grid. And we can see for the big coal consumers like China, they actually don't have any plans to reduce the coal consumption in the near term. This is what Dave was presenting as well in slides earlier, like for the next 5 years. All the forecasts I've seen, they see the increase of coal actually in the energy mix.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Situation.
Thanks, and it's heartening to see the first true offshore wind targets appear in the PDP-8 draft as well, and we're hoping those will be confirmed soon. Dave, maybe back to you for a brief comment, and then we can turn to Cameron for his thoughts as well. But do you have any comments on kind of the powerhouse coal consumers in Asia, or perhaps technology mix in the net zero roadmaps?
I do think that one of the things that I think was always concerning everyone to start with was how do you attract that much investment in so late? So there's this huge transition that needs to come around. Like, how do you find that much money? And what you're seeing day by day is just the amount that companies are stepping up into that, the ambitions to which they have, the access to cash and the technology that they have. And now it's almost like the kind of companies are leading on this transition, and they need the governments to step up more. They need the governments to keep pace. So they need the governments to make sure that that whole clean transition, cold clean transition is aligned. So that means that they need to be thinking about the grid integration issues is enabling to that investment. They need to think about like making sure there's enough auction process and the auctions, the process around the wind and solar auctions to make sure that investment can happen. And they need to ensure that it's not being crowded out by other technologies. So it needs to be, so for in the case of building new coal, it's switching that pipeline off altogether. And also for gas, trying to take some of that hot air out of gas, knowing that money is available to step up into clean and act as an enabler to bring that money that the companies want to spend to fruition.
Thanks, Dave. And I think that's a great seg to Cameron, looking from your perspective as a developer, what are the kind of system considerations in emerging economies in Southeast Asia when you're looking at coal to clean, and maybe you can also draw from the experience in the UK.
Sure, I'd be very happy to. Might just pick up on your point regarding the PDP8 and the commitment to offshore wind in particular. It's just an example of a country in Vietnam where they have this enormous potential. It's just huge. It's just coastline, resource, opportunity. It's there for the taking. And I think, yeah, it's great to see new plans coming out that suggest that really is the case. So, yeah, I mean, I see that as hugely encouraging. The opportunities there. Turning back to the UK, I mean, I think, yeah, what happened in the UK in 1990, 70% of our generation was coal-fired. It's currently 3%, and by 2024, it'll all be off. So that's a good story. The problem is it took 35 years. And I think the challenge for talking specifically about the more mature markets, the OECD markets, need to do it in 10 years. And that's a far bigger challenge. And I suppose the question is, what can we take from the UK's experience? What can we apply? And I think the big thing is simply that it is massive economic sense. We've seen, offshore wind in particular go from when I started to 15 years ago in offshore wind, probably 155, 160 pounds a megawatt hour, down to 35. So actually zero subsidy, less than zero subsidy. Companies are paying the government for the right to generate power. And again, recent leasing rounds showing the sums of money that companies are prepared to pay to get leasing rights. And so I think it's that point that needs to be brought to the fore in the OECD markets. This is simply economic sense. Investment in renewables is simply the economic imperative. It is the only place to put money. And that is maybe backed up by, I mean, there's always a carrot and a stick. So if the carrot is the sensible investment, the companies that have profited in the UK are invariably those that have been involved in the early stages of renewables. Same in Germany, same in other countries. These are the people that have grown, our own company among them. But the other thing is the stick. And I mean, anyone who was watching the Shell case in The Hague very recently, you can't help but notice the strapline the judge came out, which is that their activities cause a threat to the right to life. Now, anyone who's investing in fossil fuels now has to have that in the back of their head. So I think, the challenge to me is not, can it be done? Because of course it can be done. It can be done. It was done in the UK. We are talking about countries which have massive solar resources, which gives a far better level of diversity with offshore wind and solar than you do in many other countries, particularly, as I say, the UK, particularly with wind, which is less diverse. So the opportunity is there, the chance is there, the economic imperative is there. The simple chance is who is going to grab it first. That would be my 10 pence worth as to where I think we need to go. And it's just those key simple messages. It is economic sense, and you need to be answerable for the decisions we're making now, because our eyes are open. You can go back in the 1990s, you can go back to the 2000s, and our eyes weren't open. They're absolutely open now.
Thanks, Cameron. I think these are excellent points, and I'd like to ask a follow-up question around how far these economics of coal-fired generation versus new wind and solar investment will really take us. And maybe turning to Amar, working at Vestas in India, there's no conversation about coal to clean in Asia, which can happen without India. And you hear a lot about stranded asset risk for coal plants. Fewer public funders, fewer banks are willing to finance them. There's a lot of public pressure to divest. What does the political impetus to divest look like? Are there still strong political drivers to push coal? And how can we, as non-state actors, talk about wind and renewables so that they're seen as political wins? Amar, over to you.
Sure, thank you, Joyce. See, before I come to India, at least the one data point is that 2/3 of the population in the world live in the countries where renewables are the cheapest option now. In India also, if you see government from the highest office, that is the office of Prime Minister, they have made their intention very clear during the the Paris Accord in December 2015, where more than 196 countries agreed by consensus, and they came out with the INDC, intended nationally determined contribution. So if you see, India also came out with a very collaborative, very inclusive kind of INDC, and as per that, if you see, improve the emission intensity of its GDP by 30 to 35% by 2030, below the the level of 2005. Also increase the share of non-fossil fuel-based electricity by 40% by 2030, and enhance the forest cover to further, the absorb 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So I think they are showing their clear way towards energy transition from coal to the renewables. Also, on the other side, we are witnessing that there is no new coal plant has been announced in last 4 or 5 years. We are witnessing that there's a systematic phase out plan for existing coal plant that we are, quite evidently observing here in this country as a part of energy transition. And, if I talk about the cost also, so we are observing that the cost of renewables are declining, whereas the cost of the fossil fuel based electricity is increasing because of the limited hours of working and phasing out of, the approach. If you see, Carbon Tracker estimates the around 30% of a global coal fleet makes a profit of no more than $5 per megawatt hour. And a 5% annual reduction in utilization versus Carbon Tracker's base case, would see the global coal unprofitability is almost doubling from 27% today to 52% in 2030, and further increasing to around 77% in 2040. So India also, we are quite seeing that, a lot of push is there, but not for a coal side now. We are seeing the push for the renewable energy side, and the power sector undertakings, we call it as a PSUs, which are like 9 diamonds of the government of India. They are also showing a keen interest for a massive deployment of renewable energy. For example, NTPC, they have recently, doubled their renewable energy deployment target to 60 gigawatt by 2032. And also they are coming out with a joint venture company with ONGC to, put up more renewable energy capacity in the country. They're also coming out with a massive offshore wind project investment in the country. So all these, messages we are getting, which are pro to, renewable energy as a part of climate change, energy transition, net zero activity. We are not witnessing such kind of drive for coal right now in the country. In fact, as I said, coal, contribution has been going down significantly. Once upon a time, it was more than 60%. Now it is, coming down to around 50% and so from the overall energy, sources of the country. So, the story is not very pro for coal here in this part of the world, and it is going towards the more on renewable side. Thank you.
Thanks, Amar. Those are very clear points. I think optimism, but backed up by evidence as well. Thanks for your contribution. Dave, maybe just a quick comment from you as well. If we've spoken about Vietnam, we've spoken about India. Are there any other countries that you've mapped out when you've looked at the leaderboard for coal phase out across Asia, where it seems to be a little bit more politically challenging?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step on all those countries is to actually make that commitment to say, right, okay, we're not going to build any new coal. So in the case of India that I was just talking about, there's a current pipeline that will be built in the next 3 years. Probably after that, there's not going to be hardly any coal power plants being built. But there are a whole load on the table. So how do you take them off the table? How do you get the Indian government to actually kind of sit down, go, right, okay, that's it. We've had our kind of full of coal. From now on, all of our electricity demand will be met by clean electricity. And at the start, Joyce, you said on this question about the political will for coal, and there's one thing that's changed over the last 5 years is actually that most of that political will for coal has completely disappeared. So there's not like a barrier now. Everyone knows you need to phase out of coal, like at every level. So actually, weirdly, that feels quite nice in a way. But there's two real things that are lacking that follow on from that. Number one is the that next set of dots hasn't been joined, which is that actually we would need to be phasing out gas next as well, and gas, especially within the power sector next. So people have got that bit on coal, but there's still massive amounts of gas investment coming through. And there's a question in the question box about that, which is really interesting, and maybe that gets taken into the discussion. But the second point as well that's missing is on the political will side is just how much effort needs to happen to make that clean side step up. So everyone wants to embrace it and it's happening, but it's not happening with the urgency and focus that it needs to happen. So that would be my answer to that political will part. We've got that first part of taking coal out of the equation. It's just now how do we get on and accelerate that next part of the transition?
Great. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about implementation and policy actions which are needed in the short term to get us to a coal phase out tipping point. Let's turn to Cameron and then Amar to talk about the sort of actions that from your organization's perspectives, you'd like to see, whether that's updated NDCs under the Paris Agreement or something more around specific regulation. How can countries send the right market signals to ramp up renewables deployment and push coal off the grid? Over to you first, Cameron.
Sure. So, I mean, I suppose the key point with this is to see a structured approach to the rollout of renewables stage by stage. If there's a lesson to be learned from a number of countries, Germany, certainly the UK, is that you structure your policies and your tariff mechanisms and your grid in order to allow the phase in of particular technologies. So what do I mean by that? So you need to start obviously with some degree of fixed price system. You need to develop the supply chain, you need to develop infrastructure, you need to allow companies such as Vestas and Co to invest because they need to see some long-term security. So you need to see some projects coming through with a degree of certainty, both on tariff, access to grid, etc. And that can be, at the start, relatively more expensive. And then you have the step down into competitive auctions for pricing. Again, that can happen, but you need to identify on that way if there are key projects you need to support, such as happened in the UK with the FID enabling projects, which allowed a couple of very significant projects to go forward. And it was those projects that built, for example, the big Siemens blade factory that they have in the Humber. And that was based upon, again, just identifying key strategic projects and making sure they happened. And then after that, once you've evolved the supply chain that's comfortable and can compete, then you move towards more of a transition into direct auction pricing. So I think it's important that people maybe identify the stage that each technology is at in a region. Don't try and jump to auctions too quickly. Don't try and open up to open market too quickly. Keep some control over that at the early stages and make sure that you've got a balanced approach to getting the right technologies to the right stage where they can then have some longevity in the market. I think these are important. So again, that's more potentially at a country, regional level. I think, there's a number of places people have got this wrong, places where people have gone far too quickly to an auction and simply priced people out of the market and projects that won't work. But I think the other lesson that I'm particularly keen is that we need to do more with the supply chain rather than evolving what had become quite a competitive landscape. I think increasingly people are starting to see we should be collaborating with the supply chain and developers in the early stages so that over the period of 4 to 5 years of a project, you build the right supply chain. The supply chain has a chance to invest in those projects. So those are kind of two pieces I would say. One is structure your market appropriately for the technology's stage of deployment. And secondly, let's do better than we did in the UK and Germany by working with the supply chain in the early stages to create an optimal supply chain, which is right for developers, right for supply chain, and right for the pricing. Great,
thanks, Cameron. And I think this segs nicely to Amar India's really pushing its Make in India initiative, as well as its self-reliance initiative, and we're starting to see wind equated with supply chain development and possibly export in India now. So any comments from your side?
Yeah, I think before I make a comment on policy, I just would like to give you some data point. If you see the total installed capacity, energy installed capacity in the country as on 1st of May 2021 is around 384 gigawatt. And out of that, 50% is still coming from coal. 1/4 of that is coming from from renewable energy. The target is way high. It's around 40% for us by 2030 for renewable energy. So still, I think substantial portion of energy is coming from coal in India today. Well, government has come out with a lot of policies, for energy transition. We have policies for onshore wind. We have policy for a smooth transition from, feed-in tariff to now the competitive bidding process or auction process. Government is also, waiving off a lot of, the charges, like, the interstate transmission charges waiver has now been extended till June of 2025. So there are many things which are, there. But I feel that, still there's something is lacking. And that particular point is that policy framework should enable unlocking investment. In spite of having a lot of policies on onshore wind front, if you see, the challenge is the scaling up of the capacity. Last 3-4 years, if you see, the wind installation has been consistently lower. It is less than 2 gigawatt year on year, and that is not helping this sector. Okay, especially the manufacturing, especially OEMs, the supply management, and so on and so forth. We have around 4,000 MSMEs, working for this sector. Around 2 million jobs have been created by this sector, and around 10,000 megawatt of manufacturing capacity is there in the country for wind alone, putting all OEM put together. But now you have a yearly commissioning volume is around 2 gigawatt or so. That means only 20% of the total manufacturing capacity is getting utilized. That's the challenge. How to unlock this? And perhaps, now as you see, a lot of thousands of, the scientists and the institutions like IEA have made it crystal clear that, the countries around the world must urgently accelerate their energy transition activity. And as a part of that, they have to scale up the investment. That is much needed parameter, and that will come through policy. Now, we are always talking about decarbonizing our electricity, but we also need to see the overarching strategy of decarbonizing our transport system, our buildings, our infrastructure, our the industries, and that will be powered by the renewable power. Last but not the least, I would say there are a lot of the policies on onshore, but what we need is a very structured policy for offshore wind. We need a policy for nearshore wind. We need a policy for the repowering of old wind turbine, because they are sitting at the most high potential wind sites in the country right now. We need policy for recycling of old blades, and of course we need a policy. They have given the production incentive to solar PV sector. We need a similar kind of incentive for boosting the wind turbine manufacturing activity for 3 megawatt and above, and then future offshore wind. Last but not the least, we need a policy for integration of renewable energy with green hydrogen. Thank you.
Thanks, Amar. So what we're picking up here is a need for increasingly sophisticated system planning, where there's greater alignment between the deployment pace as well as the industrial development pace, so that you're not having these overheated markets with unused manufacturing capacity, where there's grid forward planning, where there's also the necessary investment in R&D and the wider enabling technologies for balancing. And I think when we talk about system planning, we've been dancing around a question which Dave, you've also touched on, and which has come through from a few members of the audience, as well as including someone named Olivia Beek. Thank you very much, Olivia, for your question. People are wondering about the transition from coal to clean and where gas fits in. And usually in these discussions, we switch just from coal to clean, but I think in Asia Pacific, and particularly in Southeast Asia, even in these modeling scenarios under the IEA and Irena, there is still a prolonged dependency on gas more than in other regions of the world. So how should we approach the role of gas in this transition? Some folks are asking about how we can ensure that it is not seen as a bridging fuel, as a so-called clean transitional technology. Others are asking whether, we need to accept that dependency and then work collectively to reduce that dependency in a kind of incremental approach. I'm going to leave this open to the floor, but perhaps, Benoit, you raised this in your opening remarks, and we can start with you for your thoughts here, and then we can turn to any others who might want to comment.
Yeah, I started just as an observation, the different forecasts I've seen, and it seemed that gas is proposed as a way to bridge, but actually there are other technical solutions, different ways of storing the power. One thing that is quite exciting, I think, is the electrical vehicles. There'll be, I think, a very big impact on the grid of the future. How fast they take on and what is going to be the impact, I think it's quite difficult to predict, but I think it's definitely going to have a role to play. Then I think the role of hydrogen, that has been very hot topic, is also like filling this gap of being able to store the power and be able to reuse it in the industries or release the power later. But I think you will need to have some kind of solution to balance the viability of renewables. And this comes at a cost as well. So unless there is a very strong government will to subsidize this, I think it's going to be necessary to go through gas, which is at the moment the cheapest option.
Any other comments from the panel? Cameron, I can see you raring to come in.
Yeah, just briefly, I think Olivia's point is very relevant. She mentioned the fact that, and thank you, Olivia, for your question, but you mentioned that in the UK, we still have these challenges to delivery across the company. And that's fair, but I think that's an important point in relation to the gas issue, because clearly the reason we have these constraints around transmission and distribution is because the system was built for large coal-fired power stations. And the big thing really here is that by going to gas, you don't short circuit that. Replacing one large dispatchable power station with a different type of large dispatchable power station doesn't fix it. So I think, in many ways, it's a sticking plaster, and it's not a very good sticking plaster. What you want to do is take a look at how you make a far more decentralized grid system, a far more intelligent system with energy consumers, linking to battery powers and storage, linking to electrical vehicles, reducing the need for vast decentralized grids, but moving forward with HVDC, looking again, potentially hydrogen storing and battery. There are a raft of clever and innovative solutions that are coming in, particularly around HVDC, let's be honest, which can solve these problems, but you're not going to solve them if you just chuck more gas-fired power stations in the existing locations. So I think that's a core question you made, Olivia, and yeah, thank you for it.
Thanks, Cameron. And Dave, maybe turning to you, I'm thinking of that donut graph you showed us with around 70% of global power coming from wind and solar. What are your thoughts on the technology mix here?
Well, the IEA make it quite clear that the best pathway to 1.5 degrees in the carbon budget that we've got is to not just be phasing out coal by 2040 globally, but to be fully phasing out gas power as well by 2040, to heading to 100% clean power. So, so Cameron's talking about the UK's journey. We phased out coal already. We had 4 years in a row of falling gas generation, and on a kind of level now where we're hoping to get towards zero gas generation by 2035 or thereabouts. And at the moment we're working as trying to persuade the government to actually make that a policy in the US. That is what Biden's heading for, and made explicit 2035 clean power. So so within the US, obviously the build up of shale gas has led to this huge explosion of gas power. All of that will be out the mix by 2035. And just broadly from that G7 announcement, decarbonized electricity by in the 2030s, like there's that real momentum going on now. So really, where Asia has started that gas build up a little bit already, it's not really kind of embedded and endemic in the same way it is across Europe, across the US, and it's kind of time now really to nip it in the bud and say this isn't just about phasing out coal. There's also prepping for the longer term that you all need to be phasing out gas as well, and that means that we just can't afford to be making that gas investment today.
Thanks, Dave. And I think part of this equation is how can we bring the public along with us? to support renewables and really make the public, make the people in these countries part of the wave of movement, part of the campaign for renewables. And one of the easiest channels to do so is job creation. So let's step back a little bit and talk about the human resources required to deliver this transition. And we hear a lot of these terms like people-centered transition or a just and inclusive transition. It would be great to unpack these a little bit and talk about the kinds of either policies or programs or investments, training capacity, which are going to be needed to really ensure that we can move workers from sunset industries like coal and like gas into a clean energy sector workforce. So maybe we can turn to Benoit and then Cameron for some remarks here, and then we'll do a final roundup question just to close off the discussion. Benoit, let's start with you first.
Okay, well, I guess it's a bit of a difficult question. I think the government, when they decide to go through this journey of dephasing coal, they will have to put some funds and create the frameworks to be able to provide some assistance to help the workers and communities to be able to prosper in a decarbonized economy. So this transition is not going to happen on its own. I think it's going to require a lot of investment, to look at labor reskilling and do like development programs. But on the upside is we can see that renewable energy generates a lot of jobs, and so you have it on the like OEM side, like Hama was speaking of with the example of India, but it's also requiring a lot of staff to operate and maintain the assets, and so I think it's a prospect for like large job creations in the society of the future, like a decarbonized economy. Now, to be able to transition the current worker in the coal industry to renewables is not going to be easy, and the government will have to sponsor this transition.
Thanks, Benoit. Over to you, Cameron.
Yeah, interesting. When I was at school, I used the term sunset industry. It's interesting. When I was at school, oil and gas was a sunrise industry. So I don't know quite why, but that's just interesting because, of course, now it takes that moniker. I don't think it's that tricky. I think a lot of what we've done in renewables, the people that we've employed over the last 20 years, large numbers of them have come from other sectors. A lot of ex-military people, very good. People from different parts of the world, production, manufacturing, and yeah, there's some training. But fundamentally, you know, when people come into this industry, they bring skills, they bring experience, they bring personality, they bring knowledge. It's not that hard. Training can be structured. The technology itself works well. So yeah, I do see this as a great place for people to come. We probably just need to open the door a bit more, identify where the opportunities are, and be a little more pragmatic about who we can take on. You know, if you're starting as a young engineer, young graduate, this is the place to be. There's no doubt about it. This is the place to be. Not a place to be, the place to be.
Great, thank you. A broad pitch for the wind sector and the renewable sector to any audience members today. Let's do a quick lightning question round, and then we can start to close down this webinar. So I'm going to turn attention back to COP26. Of course, with this is an official side event of UNFCCC, Asia Pacific Climate Week, so we can't get away with it without addressing COP26. I'd like to ask for a 30-second response from each panelist to the question, what would you like to see? What do we need to see at COP26 this year to accelerate Asia's coal to clean transition? And this can come from policymakers, it can come from non-state actors, it can come from funders. Be creative. We'll go in this order. Let's start with Dave, Amar, Benoit, and we'll end with Cameron. Dave, over to you first.
It needs a big commitment to 1.5 degrees, and it needs that commitment into the next step of that is a pledge for 2030. So, like, how do you actually cut emissions this decade? And when you work that backwards, like Japan's going through that learning process at the moment, it's going to come out and it's going to realize, okay, that means we need a coal phase out this decade. It means that we can't afford any more new gas investment. It means that we need that massive step up in clean electricity investment into wind and solar now. So that's my hope for COP26, that we'll have that focus on this decade and what needs to happen to cut emissions to 2030.
Thanks, Dave. Amar?
Yeah, so my view here is that during COP22, we identified the macro level overarching strategy on INBC as far as India is concerned. And as a part of that, we identified the short-term goal, which is 175 gigawatt by 2022, and long-term goal, which is 450 gigawatt of renewable energy deployment by 2030. But we need two more things now out of this COP26. One is that what is going to happen after 2030 in India. So the target for 2040, 2050, and so on and so forth. And second important point is that in order to increase the deployment by 5 times, 6 times, we have to come out with a mission mode kind of project approach. Because the setting target is one thing, but how are you going to achieve that? So that part probably should be putting on the center stage, and then derive all the policy, strategy, action based on that. So these are the 2 points from my side for COP26.
Thanks, Amar. Over to you, Benoit.
Yeah, I'd like to quote my CEO, Ditlev Engel. So he used to be a CEO of Vestas, actually. He's saying he's technology optimistic, but regulatory pessimistic. And so I think what he means is that we already have the solutions, technical solutions to make it work and make a very fast transition. What we really need now is the policies from governments to make it happen.
Thanks, Benoit. Short and sweet. And over to you, Cameron.
Well, I think you probably gather it needs to be people. I think what we should do at COP26 is somehow manage to appeal to the generation that's going to drive us forward, to the young, dynamic, diverse, people, the Greta's choice people, such as yourself, who are going to drive this agenda forward and hopefully kick me and a number of the grey-suited men out the other door and make it happen. So I think it's appealing in COP26 to the next generation that's coming on to really drive this forward so that they create a better world for themselves.
Great. Thank you all for the sharing your insights with us today. And it's been a fascinating discussion, I think. There are areas where there's very strong consensus and areas where there's less so, but I think that raises the responsibility of all of us to really better understand what are the levers at our disposal, on top of the technology, economics, and increasingly the talent being on the side of renewables. Where do we need to put in more work to accelerate this transition? From what it sounds like, a lot of this is going to be around policy implementation, as well as regulation, as Benoit said, regulation pessimistic, and just ensuring that the public is on our side in this transition as well. So I think we can close it down here and end at the hour. I thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar, and another big appreciation to all of our speakers for taking the time out of their very busy schedules to share their thoughts with us. If you have any further questions on what we've discussed here today, you can get in touch with GWEC or Ember by visiting our websites. Thank you again for joining us. Wishing you further productive and enjoyable sessions at UNFCCC Asia Pacific Climate Week and a great rest of your day. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.